Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. Leaders of India and ASEAN on Thursday discussed ways to boost maritime security, connectivity and trade as Prime Minister Narendra Modi asserted that India shares the ASEAN vision for rule-based societies and pitched for freedom of navigation in the region. Prime Minister Modi underscored the ever-evolving ASEAN-India partnership, terming the summit as the grand finale of the joint year-long commemorative activities organized among the nations. Prime Minister Modi further touched on the religious ties that bind all the nations. Speaking on the diplomatic ties, the Prime Minister stressed that ASEAN is at the center of India's Act East policy. The Prime Minister also expressed India's commitment to work with the ASEAN nations to enhance collaboration in the maritime domain. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the takeaways from the summit. Joining me on the program today are KP Nayar, strategic analyst, Ashok Sajjanhar, former diplomat, Srikanth Kondapalli, Professor, Center for East Asian Studies, JNU, and Upendra Das, Head Center for Regional Trade. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, I'd like to begin with you, of course. What were your key takeaways from the summit?
Key takeaways from Prime Minister Modi's statement at the plenary, first of all, that there are huge opportunities that await both India and ASEAN to strengthen their relations, and these stronger ties are going to be beneficial and advantageous not only for India, not only for ASEAN, for the region and for the world in terms of the security, stability and prosperity. He, in my views, pressed all the right buttons because he spoke, first of all, about maritime security, because that is an issue that that has become alive with a number of ASEAN nations, whether it is Vietnam, Philippines, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, 5 of them at least. And of course, as far as India is concerned, looking at the expansionist policies and the of China in South China Sea, that has become a cause of worry and concern. So he stressed on the fact that there has to be rule of law, and he particularly mentioned also the primacy of the United Nations Convention on Law of the Seas 1982, which should govern relations there. Then, of course, as the Prime Minister has mentioned earlier also, it is commerce in terms of the economic partnership, and that was also something that the Singapore Prime Minister, who's now become the chair of ASEAN for the coming year, he also mentioned in terms of the investment trade relations between the two countries, how significant they are, how important they are. And of course, the Prime Minister mentioned that over the last 25 years, we have been able to take our trade forward 25 times. But still the potential, in my view, and I think everyone realizes it, that the potential is much larger than that. The third aspect on this is connectivity. Connectivity, not only in terms of physical connectivity, we've been talking about connecting our northeastern states through the trilateral highway, through Myanmar to Thailand and beyond, also that to Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam. So connectivity, both physical and digital, and maritime connectivity and air connectivity, because some of the cities, of course, and countries are well linked with India through civil aviation. But much of ASEAN is not linked. Then he also brought in the 1,000 year of our relationship in Ramayana and Buddhism. Yes.
All right. Okay, we'll continue talking about the religious ties and the historic ties and the cultural ties ahead in the program. But let me bring in my other panelists as well. Mr. Nayar, the messaging from the Prime Minister loud and clear as to what's in store for India and ASEAN in the days to come. But these 10 heads of state from the ASEAN countries will also be the chief guests for the Republic Day parade. A historic moment indeed, because we've never had that many guests, chief guests at the Republic Day. Is there some kind of a messaging in that?
This is certainly an occasion for great celebration, having all the 10 heads of state or government from the ASEAN. But what worries me is a disconnect between what the government is doing and the public perception of this whole relationship.
Public perception on which side?
See, if you read the media, for example, and if you follow some of our strategic analysts, the impression is created that the whole effort is to use the ASEAN to contain China, But if you read the readout of the Prime Minister's meetings, that is not true at all, I mean, the Prime Minister, for example, mentioned the idea of declaring 2019 as a year of tourism, very good thing. Then he mentioned connectivity, and immediate reaction from the media and some of the strategic analysts is that connectivity and maritime cooperation involves freedom of navigation in South China Sea and restraining China, I don't think that is what the Prime Minister meant, See, so the government is trying to give a creative spin to the whole relationship, India can do so much with the ASEAN, and the effort, in my opinion, is not at all from the point of view of the government to contain China. Why bring in China into our relationship with the ASEAN, But it's very unfortunate that the public perception, contributed by many strategic analysts who feel that the environment in the country is very conducive to China bashing, I think it doesn't help the relationship with the ASEAN at all.
Professor Kondapalli has a smile on his face. China, of course, is the elephant in the room. And, can you talk about the ASEAN countries without bringing up China, really?
Well, we are now in a very interconnected world, and many issues, they will have a spillover effect on other regions as well. The ASEAN was formed in 1967 with two major drivers. One is the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. Second is a nuclear weapon free zone. Now, in South China Sea, obviously the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation has a problem, because since 2010, the Hanoi meeting, since then, there is no consensus within ASEAN in relation to the South China Sea dispute. So there is some trouble brewing up within ASEAN. In the ARF 26 members, it is reported that something like 12 countries have actively opposed China's role in the South China Sea related issue. So there is a spillover effect in terms of the militarization of some of the reefs that have happened with the Hongqi 9 surface-to-air missile systems, or the other reefs being militarized by China. But to be fair, even Vietnam or other countries have also been expanding their profile in the region. But China's militarization is almost about 3,000 acres of land has been reclaimed within these island reefs. So since the PCA ruling, Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling, in July 2016, the ASEAN is now a kind of divided house. So they approached the United States, where they have had summit meetings like the one that we are seeing now in New Delhi. They have approached the Chinese before, they have approached the Japanese. So in typical ASEAN way, they are trying to kind of balance by bringing in another big player, which is India. And for India, India does not have any sovereignty claims in the region. When Bangladesh went to the Hague Tribunal, India had given up those two islands which are in dispute. So India had sent a signal of being relatively objective for the rule of law on the question of islands sovereignty. Secondly, on the freedom of navigation, both in the Indian Ocean as well as in the South China Sea, there was the mention about the freedom of navigation issues. Partly because India has its own concerns in this region, because it's roughly about 45 to 50% of India's trade is passing through, and the concept of territorial sea as adopted by, say, China or Vietnam or Malaysia is problematic for Indian trade in this region.
Sure.
So to that extent, it is a self-interest for India, but for largely for the other ASEAN countries as a whole, freedom of navigation provides them with some kind of a counter to China, which treats 80% of 3.4 million square kilometers of South China Sea as its own, as they say, undisputed, sovereign claim.
Right, right.
So to that extent, I think India provides for a kind of balancing role.
Sure.
I do not think it is containment, but it is kind of balancing role.
Okay, great. Professor Das, is there enough space in the region really for India and China to both coexist?
Certainly. In fact, if you see this entire endeavor, I see it from two perspectives. One is, this is essentially a bilateral coming together of India and ASEAN, because we have historical connect, religious, cultural connect, and we have very important economic potential, which is still untapped. This is one part of it. Second is a broader Asian economic integration. If this is going to be an Asian century, the broader Asian economic integration is something or a canvas in which India and ASEAN want to play a very determining role. If this is so, then hitherto India was possibly less active in terms of contributing to overall Asian economic integration landscape. And this event of these 10 leaders being here is nothing but a manifestation of really acting on our Act East policy. It is actually underscoring that. If that is so, nobody can deny the fact that Asian economic integration and Asian century cannot be brought out only by India and ASEAN. You have to have a cooperative framework where Japan, China, Australia, New Zealand, and other countries will have to play a very proactive role. I would hasten to add the fact that historically Indian subcontinent and South Asia was an economic hub which linked Central Asia, Eurasia, and West Asia on this side to Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Oceania on the other, through spice route, silk route, cotton route, and so on. Perhaps this is the time when this endeavor of India-ASEAN coming together is going to reconnect the eastern side of Asia to the western side of Asia via South Asia and Indian subcontinent. And that is why India's proactive role and ASEAN's response that today they are all here together is going to contribute to that. And perhaps that is going to translate into an Asian economic integration.
So it's a win-win for all is what you're suggesting. Yeah. Okay, great. Moving ahead now. Ambassador, how has our Act East policy worked really, and what are we doing differently now?
Well, Frank, very interesting question, because, one must realize that, number one, Act East policy is a successor to the Look East policy. And the Look East policy, when it was there for 20 odd years, it has performed extremely well. Sorry.
That's okay. Ambassador, do clear your throat and come back to us. I'll just come back to you. In the meantime, let me bring in the other guests as well. Mr. Nayar, what challenges do you foresee for, for the ties between India and ASEAN?
Well, in my opinion, the big takeaway from this summit, preceded by the Prime Minister's visit to Manila for the ASEAN event, is really the Philippines. Unfortunately, we don't pay much attention to the Philippines. You see, people forget that Philippines is one country in Southeast Asia with which India has had no disputes, not even ethnic, like Malaysia, Singapore, and all that, where Indians historically got into trouble with the Chinese and the Malays and all that. And yet this is a relationship that did not blossom, you know. When Prime Minister went to Manila in November, it was the first summit with the Filipinos in 36 years to be held in Manila. And Philippines is the one country in the region which is going through dramatic changes. It was earlier seen, to put it rather uncharitably, as a US colony, but President Duterte, I mean, when he became president, he moved it away, you know, he went to China.
And they seem to have a very dynamic leader in Rodrigo Duterte at the moment.
Yes, yes. And after the bilateral with President Duterte yesterday, the readout from our side talks about India's contribution to Philippines build program and effort to have mutual investments and all that. See, our relationship with most of the ASEAN countries is now good, and Philippines was one blind spot, you know, one vacant spot. And I think in terms of challenge that you asked, what we have to build on is the relationship with the Philippines, so that the picture of our bilateral collaboration with ASEAN will be complete.
Okay, fair enough. Ambassador, let me come back to you now to the point that you are making about, you know, the Act East policy and the Look East policy.
Yeah, so, you know, there were very compelling reasons why the Look East policy was initiated and launched in 1992. And it did work well for the 20 years. As you know, we mentioned earlier, the trade between ASEAN and India increased about 25-fold over these years. But then it was found that it has really become stagnant. It has, come into a morass, and there was need for further invigoration and giving greater dynamism to it. So that is how it was launched in November 2014 at the East Asia Summit in Myanmar by Prime Minister when he went to participate in the first East Asia Summit there. And I can say that, you know, over the last 3 years plus, it is a work in progress. But in terms of the energy that it has imparted to the relationship, that is truly commendable, because it has focused on all the issues where there is huge potential, but where in terms of the results, there has not been much to see. I would mention in terms of the connectivity issue, for instance, you know, this trilateral highway going from northeast of India through Myanmar to Thailand and beyond. That has been going on for a large number of years. But, you know, there are positive indications that are available that it is going to be completed by 2019, by next year. Similar is the case as far as Kaladan multimodal transport is concerned. And when the Prime Minister was participating at the East Asia Summit in Kuala Lumpur in 2015, he assigned $1 billion to promote connectivity, both physical connectivity and digital connectivity. Sure. The other is, of course, commerce. We have spoken about trade and investment. We have the negotiations on the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. They have been going on since 2012. I think there is need for us to conclude that quickly, maybe within this year, so that will also be an indication of the seriousness on both sides, on India as well as ASEAN and the other participating countries, Australia, New Zealand,
so you're suggesting that,
Japan,
that we
and
need
China, that we mean business to take our relationship forward.
Sure. Sure. So you're suggesting that we need to speed up our projects, and also over the last few years, the pace of the projects has picked up is what you're suggesting, and that's what's really changed over the last few years. Professor Kondapalli, you know, the theme this time around is shared values, common destiny. How do you see that being translated on the ground?
Well, the many ASEAN countries are maintaining very high percentage of growth rates. And also many are kind of diversified with the HRD profile and so on and so forth. there is, since the labor costs are relatively low within the ASEAN as with India, you have a lot of complementarities between India and ASEAN. So one aspect is the economic one. Second is, since the ASEAN is, as we discussed, the maritime related issues, on those there is the International Maritime Organization estimated that 52% of global piracy incidents are actually now happening in Southeast Asia. Piracy, previously it was off Somalia, now it is mainly in the Southeast Asian region. Since the Indian Navy has substantial advantages, this is one area which has been identified for counter-piracy missions. In 2006, India had suggested to the counter-piracy as well as protection of the Straits of Malaccas, which is where the Andaman Nicobar Joint Command and the bilateral naval exercises with Singapore and Malaysia and Vietnam all have come into the picture. So in terms of the shared values and so on, this is one area that is now being worked about on the sea lanes of communications, and most likely that we will have a naval exercise combinedly with the ASEAN countries in this region.
Sure.
So this is one aspect of that. Second, economy, and obviously there is also the commerce related, as was been mentioned,
right,
on trade and so on.
Right.
In the IMF and World Bank estimates, Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, they all figure out in big numbers for the next foreseeable future. So clubbing up with them also reinforces the Indian growth story. To that extent, I think this is also...
So we'll be in good company.
Indeed.
Right. Okay. Professor Das, going forward, would it suit us well to look at ASEAN as a bloc and indulge with them in multilaterals, or should we have bilaterals with these individual countries to take our tie forward, or do you think we need a combination of both?
A combination, because two nations, when they interact, there are certain issues that are very basically very much bilateral in nature. You cannot discuss certain bilateral issues in a plurilateral or regional forum. So in that sense, you will have issues, say, between India and Thailand and India and Malaysia or India, Indonesia, which are very different. On the other hand, because ASEAN has always interacted with its dialogue partners in ASEAN +1 framework, we would be interacting and strengthening our partnership with ASEAN as a bloc. Third layer is of the Asian regionalism, whereby the ASEAN +6 countries actually are negotiating a regional comprehensive economic partnership agreement. And then you have on the strategic side ASEAN Regional Forum. So we would be interacting with them not just as ASEAN +1, but ASEAN +1++. Now, these three layers can coexist and they do not contradict, because there are certain issues that are bilateral, there are certain issues that are regional, and there are certain issues that are bilateral where India is one side and ASEAN as a bloc, and then there are certain issues that are beyond region and it's a larger region which actually gets engulfed. So therefore, I would be seeing progress, issues, action on all these levels,
right,
simultaneously, and there is no contradiction.
Okay, quick closing comments now from all my guests, because I've got limited time on the program. Starting with you, Ambassador, what is the potential of the ties between India and ASEAN going forward?
Potential is huge, Frank. I think if we take areas, whether it is trade and economic cooperation collaboration, whether it is strategic issues in terms of providing maritime security and cooperation, or it is in the area of fighting counter-terrorism, providing, having defense engagement, I think there are a large number of areas where both ASEAN and India can cooperate and collaborate. And I think one aspect that the Prime Minister made very clear is that we maintain the centrality of ASEAN in all the negotiations, whether it is in terms of ASEAN Regional Forum, it is ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, plus it is East Asia Summit, it is RCEP, whatever might be the format, for us, ASEAN is the central pillar of our Act East policy and all our engagements in that region. I think this will be very, very comforting and very satisfying as far as ASEAN is concerned, because they have been
Point
very
taken, Ambassador. Mr. Nayar.
Well, as we celebrate this occasion with 10 leaders on our Republic Day from the ASEAN, we should not forget how we got here. And I think that is what will provide the key to the future. Go back to 1992, and we had to fight at every stage to get into this relationship with the ASEAN, you know. It was after a great effort that we became a full dialogue partner with the ASEAN. To get into the ARF, we really had to struggle, not only with the ASEAN countries, but with the United States and others. And we should never forget that this whole process was started by Singapore, you know.
Sure.
I mean, 1992, National Day, Goh Chok Tong, in his speech, he outlined the idea of an India fever in Singapore, you know. So we should not forget
the history.
that now that we have got here, that we made a lot of effort and perseverance to get here.
Sure.
And then we will value where we have the relationship now.
Professor Kondapalli, the way forward.
I think there is substantial potential as well as realization of all these, mainly in the economic field, from $80 odd billion to projected, $120 billion and beyond. There is the free trade area which has come up in 2010, while there is some trade deficits, etc., that are being discussed. There is also quite huge potential because of the complementarities between the two sides in all sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, Make in India, Digital India, a host of sectors. Then also in the maritime security, there is substantial.
Sure.
For example, the Indian credit line for Vietnam.
Let me get Professor Das to close the show for us. Tremendous potential. We need to strike the right chords.
Yes, what Prime Minister Modi is trying to do in terms of Act East policy, and if the services and investment agreement is ratified by all the ASEAN countries, we have made calculations that by 2025, the present level of trade and investment linkages can be doubled.
Okay, all right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.